All right, being a more compassionate people. Okay, Matt.
All right, so here's how this objective reads. We want to examine how responsibility and power are lived in the church, as well as the structures by which they are managed, bringing to light and trying to convert prejudices and distorted practices that are not rooted in the gospel. No tolerance of any form of discrimination, racism, clericalism, judgmentalism. So power structures in the church, how authority is handled or mishandled. Here's a word that we talk about a lot, clericalism, but I'm not sure if we understand its origins. I think there's an idea out there, a shared idea, that clericalism is just this inevitable outcome of having a hierarchy, having clergy. Well, not necessarily. And actually, and there's been a number of studies on clericalism, and there's one by, and I'm blanking on his name. It was a Jesuit who wrote a book about it. It's something like Curbing Clericalism or Combating Clericalism, something like that. But at any rate, in there, he talks about how the laity tend to feed that clerical mindset. How do we do that? Well, let's take a very brief but sober look at the last 20 years and all of the, for example, sex abuse cases and allegations that have been brought forth. How has it been possible? How are those things even possible? Like, how could they happen? Part of the reason is lay people just not willing to believe that it would be possible for clergy to do those atrocious things. Now, these are extreme examples. They're terrible. They're just so unbelievably sad. But the point here is that what feeds into that clericalism is when we just can't possibly imagine that father is actually a human being, or the bishop is actually a human being, and not only a flawed one in the cases of these abuses, also a very sick one. And you can go to less extreme examples. What about just a really heavy-handed pastor, someone that doesn't want to consult, someone that doesn't think they need to consult? If people don't speak up and say, you know what, we do have some good ideas, we'll go back to objective 2 here. We're looking at our gifts. Maybe it's folks on the parish council or the finance council or just concerned parishioners. We know what our gifts are, and we think we can help out, and we've got ideas too, and we'd like to share those. And we know how many confrontations that can start, and it's unfortunate, and it shouldn't be the case that bringing forth gifts, including new ideas, would cause so much consternation, but it does if there's more of a clerical bent coming from the leadership. This idea that I know best and I'm in charge and all of that. One of the neatest things that I recall from Pope Francis, he was addressing, and this was probably a year or two after he was elected Pope, he was giving, I think it was a full-blown retreat. He participated in the retreat and he said the masses and gave the homilies, but I forget who the retreat master was. But Francis, at one point, looking at a number of cardinals and bishops, he pointed over to the Alps and he says, being a bishop is not about ladder climbing. It's not about, just trying to make it to the top. If you want to climb something, go climb the Alps, he said. It'll be healthier for you than to try to treat your ministry as some kind of a career, something where you're trying to make a name for yourself, which we often do at the expense of other people. There's no CEO, kind of harsh CEO mentalities needed in those kinds of positions. Now, we do need skills that executives possess, no doubt, but we need the ones that are positive and productive. So all that's to say about clericalism is moving forward as we address power structures in our parish, in our diocese, and anywhere in any assembly we recognize as church, we need to be aware of clericalism. In general, just non-judgmentalism. Look at the other isms they want to tackle: racism, judgmentalism. So just non-judgmentalism in general is a great approach to have, not only as a human being, but especially as a Christian. One of my favorite images. It wasn't initially, and the folks on the retreat in Colombia heard this too, is called Christ Seated in Judgment. And it's in the north apse at the Basilica. It's actually behind the sanctuary in the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. It's gorgeous, but it's super intimidating. And Jesus' brows furrowed. He's got his arms flexed. He's got flames coming out of his head, and he's draped in red robes. He's sitting in a big cathedra, a big chair. And it took me a while to kind of see the beauty of this image. And the only way you could see it is if you walked up close to the image and stood underneath it. And his face looked far more serene, and it had something to do with like the play of lights on the mosaic. But at any rate, the reason I bring this up is only Christ is seated in judgment, not us. Now, there are things we know to be sins, actions people take, or inactions that people should take, and those things can be called out, and those things are a part of admonishing the sinner, which itself is a spiritual work of mercy. But how many times do we really in charity try to admonish someone versus we try to boost our own ego and make ourselves feel better at the expense of putting somebody else in their place? So we try to leave judgment up to God, especially when it comes to judging the person. We should never do that. Only God sees the heart. Only God is seated in judgment. So non-judgmentalism, that is something we can practice right now. Open-mindedness, how are we trying to cultivate that as catechists or catechetical leaders? Empathy, is that not the greatest attitude or disposition for anything, but especially for catechesis? Empathy, to really want to walk in somebody else's shoes, to understand their life so that we can better connect with them and support them.